Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. We're going to be looking today at the plot map, specifically analyzing a story for elements of plot. It would be a good idea to take some notes, jot some note down of the definitions as I go over them. As you watch the video, I also want to remind you that you please need to remember to read The Most Dangerous Game and fill out the Talking to the Text note sheet. That'll be important. It'll offer us a nice jumping off point for class tomorrow. The essential question that's going to guide the focus of both this presentation and our work tomorrow in class is the idea of how do authors use plot to convey interesting stories. So we're going to take a look at the elements of plot and then how plot can be broken down or analyzed in a short story, which you guys will practice doing tomorrow. To begin, a brief definition of plot. This is just the sequence of events in a story. If you don't already have this in your notes, it might be a good time to jot this down as you're watching the video. Now, as far as the elements of plot, there are 5 elements. There is the exposition, which is located on the plot map right here on this line. Then after the exposition, the rising action usually happens right here. At the top of the plot chart is the climax right here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Followed by the falling action down here along this line, and then the resolution. Some of you may be familiar with this. Call this the plot diagram or the plot map. You may have used it last year as you talked about short stories or a novel and use it to analyze plot. We will be referencing it and using it again this year. Now, the exposition story, textbook definition, is the part of the story where the setting, characters, and conflict are introduced along with any other necessary information for the reader. So any good writer will clearly establish the setting where the story is taking place, identify the main characters and start to build upon their personality traits, which will help the reader decide what kind of person, whether they like the character, whether they dislike the character. And the most important thing, this is the point in the story where a conflict is introduced. Now, we talked a little bit about conflict earlier, and you should remember the different types, but this is the point in the story where we really see a conflict come into play, which will drive the rest of the plot. Up next is the rising action. This is the part of the story where the intensity rises because the conflict is being dealt with. This is the sequence of events that will eventually lead up to the climax. Things are going to start to build, and we'll look at what that looks like here in a little bit. Now, next is the climax. You may have heard the climax being described as the highest point of intensity or the most exciting moment of a story. I tend to steer away from that definition, and I'll show you why in a little bit. But I really see it as the turning point in the conflict of the story. It's where an event really leads to a head of the conflict, and the conflict starts to get resolved at that point. It is usually a moment of heightened intensity, but it's not necessarily the most exciting moment in a novel or a book or a story or whatever you happen to be experiencing. Now, the following action tends to be a catch-all. These are the events that lead to the resolution of the conflict, where we really find out how everything ends. And everything that happens after the climax, before the end of the story and the resolution, call that the following action. And then finally, the resolution. This is the end of the story, and it deals with how the conflict is resolved. Now, depending on the story you're reading, the movie you're watching, conflicts can be neatly resolved, or they can kind of be left open to interpretation by the reader, or they could be left open for other reasons, like maybe a sequel or different things like that. But we'll look at several stories that play on this whole idea of plot and structuring plot. So to give you a preview of what you're going to be doing in class tomorrow, the goal for class is going to be analyze the plot structures of the Most Dangerous Game in small groups. So you're going to break down everything that happens in a story and put it into one of the categories from plot structure. And after that, you're actually going to evaluate how each of the elements affects the reader differently. And you also have something you'll be working on in small groups, but I'll save that for tomorrow. So in order to prep you for tomorrow, I'm actually going to demonstrate how we go about analyzing plot, breaking down plot, justifying where you put how you define each element of plot in the context of a real story. And in order to do that, I'm going to use a classic story, which most of you should be familiar with, The Three Little Pigs, which just so happens exists in the public domain, so I feel okay with using it here in my course. Once upon a time, there was an old mother pig who had 3 little pigs and not enough food to feed them. So when they were old enough, she sent them out into the world to seek their fortunes. The first pig was very lazy. He didn't want to do any work at all. He built his house out of straw. The second pig worked a little bit harder, but he was somewhat lazy too, so he built his house out of sticks. Then they sang and danced and played together the rest of the day. The third little pig worked hard all day and built his house with bricks. It was a sturdy, complete house with fine fireplace and chimney. It looked like it could withstand the strongest winds. The next day, a wolf happened to pass by the lane where the three little pigs lived, and he saw the straw house and he smelled the pig inside. He thought the pig would make a mighty fine meal, and his mouth began to water. So this first section of text constitutes the exposition. Notice we get the setting, which is out in the little world, or out into the world where the mother pig sent them, and also on this lane where the three little pigs happen to build their house. We also meet the characters. So the first little pig, we get an idea of him. He was very lazy, built his house out of straw. We'll see how that works out later. Second little pig worked a little bit harder, but built his house out of sticks. Again, we're getting characterization. We're learning about the characters, which you do in the exposition. And then the fact that they sang and danced and played all together the rest of the day, that's actually indirect characterization, showing you a little bit about those two based on their actions. The same thing, we meet the third little pig who spent all day building his house out of bricks. And then it mentions the fireplace and chimney. That's a bit of foreshadowing that we'll look at in a little bit. And then finally, at the end of the exposition here, we have the conflict. When the last character comes in, the wolf, we can use our inferencing skills when he smells the pigs inside and the fact that he thinks they're making a mighty fine meal. We realize that the conflict is now a person versus person conflict with the wolf wanting to eat the little pigs. So he knocked on the door and said, little pig, let me in, let me in. But the little pig saw the wolf's big paws through the keyhole, so he answered back, no, 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 not by the hairs on my chinny chin chin. Then the wolf showed his teeth and said, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down. So he huffed and he puffed and he blew the house down. The wolf opened the jaws very wide and bit down as hard as he could. But the little pig escaped and ran away to hide in the little second pig. The wolf continued down the lane until he passed the second house made of sticks. And he saw that house and he smelled the pigs inside and his mouth began to water as he began to think about the fine dinner they would make. So he knocked on the door and said, little pigs, let me in, let me in. But the pig saw the wolf's pointy ears through the keyhole, and they answered back, no, 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 not by the hairs on my chinny chin chin. So the wolf showed his teeth and said, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down. Now, this section in text constitutes the rising action. Notice, we have a conflict, which is the idea that the wolf wants to eat little pigs. And that comes to a head as he gets to the first little pig's house, and wants in, and we know why he wants in, and the pig figures it out. And that leads to the wolf blowing down the first house. And then because this is a children's tale, it also leads to the wolf blowing down the second house. Now, you have to be able to justify, whenever you're looking at something like the rising action, you have to justify that there are events happening that are related to the conflict. Now, we know the conflict, as illustrated here in this picture, that the wolf wants to blow down the houses in order to eat the pigs. And the result of these conflicts is that he's able to do it, but the little pigs run away each time. So he huffed and he puffed and he blew the house down. The wolf was greedy and tried to catch both pigs at once, but he was too greedy and got neither. His big jaws clamped down on nothing but air, and the two little pigs scrambled away as fast as their little hooves would carry them. The wolf chased them down the lane, and he almost caught them. But they made it to the brick house and slammed the door before the wolf could catch them. The three little pigs were very frightened. They knew the wolf wanted to eat them, and that was very, very, very true. The wolf hadn't eaten all day, and he had worked up a large appetite chasing the pigs around, and he knew he could smell all three of them inside the house. He knew the three little pigs would make a lovely feast. So the wolf knocked on the door and said, little pigs, let me in, let me in. The little pigs saw the wolf narrow eyes through the keyhole, so they answered back, no, 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 not by the hairs on our chin, chin, chin. So the wolf showed his teeth and said, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down. So as you're following along the story, you'll notice we are now at the third little pig's house made out of brick. We are also at the end of the rising action. The conflict has now come to a head. Well, he huffed and he puffed, and he huffed, and he puffed and he huffed, and huffed and huffed, and he puffed, but he could not blow the house down. At last, he was so out of breath, he couldn't huff and he couldn't puff anymore. So he stopped to rest and thought a bit. This event right here, where he huffs and he puffs, and he realizes that he cannot blow the house down, this actually constitutes the beginning of the climax. Now, please follow along as I read further. But this was too much. The wolf danced with rage and swore he would come down the chimney and eat the little pigs for his supper. But while he was climbing onto the roof, the little pig made up a blazing fire and put a big pot full of water to boil. Then, just as the wolf was coming down the chimney, the little piggy with the lid and plump, in fell the wolf into the scalding water. So the piggy put the cover on again, boiled the wolf up, and the three little pigs ate him for supper. Well, class, aren't fairy tales just lovely? So, again, I want to reiterate this, but the climax comes here when the wolf is unable to blow the house down. So there is a turning point in the conflict. The wolf needs to find a new plan. Now, as part of the following action, the wolf, as he dances with rage, comes down to eat the pigs through the chimney. Another aspect of the following action is that the little pigs make up the blazing fire and put a big pot of water to boil. And then we see how this conflict is resolved when the little pigs cook the wolf and decide to eat him for supper. Again, just remember how lovely all these little fairy tales are. Now, I hope this has been a helpful analysis, or I hope this has been a helpful breakdown of how we should be analyzing plot here in our English class. Now, I want to reiterate a few things that I did. Make sure whenever you are giving an answer, you're always supporting it with details from the text. Make sure those details are in alignment with the concept. You want to be able to support your ideas with details from the text, and that will be the best way for you to support your answers. One final friendly reminder, please complete your homework, read The Most Dangerous Game, and fill out the Talking to the Text note sheet. We will be working in groups tomorrow, and have a good evening. I hope to see you tomorrow in class.